In the heart of a city painted with the strange hush of autumn, Rachel walked down the empty sidewalks of Chicago, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing into her shoulders. The streets, usually alive with the steady beat of traffic and distant laughter from the bars on Clark Street, now echoed with her quiet steps. Every movement she made seemed filled with a certain gravity, a sense of duty that had grown over years of advocacy, both inside and outside the city's police department. For Rachel, each day blended into the next, with routines built on long hours, difficult conversations, and the challenge of holding on to her beliefs, even when it felt like she was speaking into a void. She was used to Chicago's changing moods. The sudden winds off Lake Michigan, the shifting shadows thrown by streetlights along Michigan Avenue. But this evening felt different. The city seemed to be holding its breath. Rachel clutched her bag closer, not out of fear, but out of habit. Her mind replayed moments from work, tense meetings, hard-won agreements that sometimes fell apart the next day, memories of people who had come and gone, most of them worn down by the slow churn of institutional change. As she passed under the glow of yet another flickering streetlight, her routine was suddenly and sharply interrupted. She realized she was not alone. Up ahead, someone was moving with deliberate, steady steps in her direction. It was Officer Logan, someone she knew by sight and reputation, the kind of cop people talked about in half-whispers, always mentioning his unwavering command and how nothing ever seemed to rattle his composure. Logan's eyes were cool, assessing. He carried that air of authority that made strangers step back without needing to say a word. The official veneer was all there, the crisp uniform, the careful way his badge caught the light. But there was also something else, an undertone, built from years of learned dominance that lingered just beneath their exchange. Rachel felt it right away. She braced herself, aware this was not just an ordinary encounter, but something that might leave an imprint. They stopped within a few steps of each other. Logan's tone was polite, even calm, but there was a chill in his words, like this ritual had been played out many times before, with outcomes rarely questioned. In that moment, Rachel sensed that whatever was about to happen went far beyond a random stop. It marked the start of a struggle much larger than the two people standing under the amber streetlight that cold, quiet night. The tension in the air wasn't loud, but it was clear and sharp, like an invisible thread pulling tight between Rachel and Officer Logan. Logan's authority showed in every move, and with a practiced gesture, he barked out an order for Rachel to step away from the sidewalk, right up to his patrol car. There was nothing in his tone that invited questions. This was one of those moments where you simply obeyed or risked the whole thing spiraling out of control. Rachel's breath came out in quick clouds, the autumn cold settling in around her. The familiar Chicago chill pressed in, heavy and thin at once, making every word seem more important than usual. Logan loomed beside his cruiser, hands resting on his duty belt. He spoke in measured sentences, each word landing like a sentence, already passed. Rachel met his stare without flinching, her posture steady, refusing to let fear push her into shrinking away. Even as Logan explained nothing, simply stating, "Step over here," Rachel knew the ritual well enough. There was always a reason, and sometimes there was none. Just as Rachel reached the car, the quiet was split by the soft, unmistakable click of a smartphone camera. Someone across the street, half hidden by a bus shelter, had just started filming. Logan didn't seem to care, but Rachel noticed, and that tiny act shifted the energy in the air. Suddenly, this wasn't a private back and forth. Now there was an audience, and the roles of predator and prey became painfully clear. Logan snapped. "Note instructions. Take out your ID, explain your business, wait for backup." Each sentence dripped with deliberate finality. Rachel could tell that he was running through a script, not because the situation called for it, but because he could. Behind every question was the expectation of guilt, a version of the story, already written, Yet as Rachel handed over her driver's license, her eyes didn't drop. She met his gaze calmly, drawing on that quiet strength earned from years of being tested and never running. Receiving the ticket, no real explanation, just a cold policy violation, Rachel kept her composure. She accepted the paper and watched Logan as if to say, "I know what this is, and I refuse to buy in." This, she realized, was just the opening act of a battle over narrative and power, one she could influence only so much. As Logan returned to his car, Rachel stood for a moment longer beneath the streetlight, certain that the story had only just begun. In the sticky heat of a crowded diner on the south side, the kind of place where the booths were patched with duct tape and lunchtime gossip bounced off every greasy surface, Officer Logan settled in among his fellow cops. The overhead fans pushed humid air around, but no one seemed to mind as long as the coffee kept coming. Logan leaned back, waving his citation book in the air while telling his story. His voice carried across plates of half-eaten burgers and piles of fries, describing with a sort of careless pride how he had put someone in their place the night before. His friends laughed, a few shaking their heads while others offered congratulations, in the form of claps on the back. Logan stretched his shoulders, convinced that what happened would be just another half-forgotten story, lost in the ever-spinning wheel of Chicago's daily grind. Around here, authority was rarely questioned, and time did its best to bury even the stickiest of situations. To him, the whole thing was already fading, a small win in a career built on bigger ones. But while Logan basked in the comfort of power, Rachel was sitting quietly at her kitchen table on the north side in a modest apartment above a bakery that always smelled of cinnamon in the mornings. The apartment was quiet, except for the occasional rumble of the L train passing by her window. She had her phone, a notebook, and the crumpled ticket that had been thrust into her hand. Her mind replayed the encounter in careful detail. For Rachel, this wasn't something she could let slide. She started gathering everything, the video that surfaced online, a shaky but clear clip showing Logan's approach, her own notes, and even the names of the witnesses who had been nearby. This wasn't just about that single stop. Rachel understood she was pushing back against a much bigger machine, powered by years of unspoken rules and the expectation that nobody would bother to fight back. As the afternoon light turned golden, Rachel organized each piece of evidence, thinking not just of herself, but all the others who had crossed similar paths and walked away helpless. She drafted a formal complaint to the city's Civilian Office of Police Accountability, then another to the local union representative, well aware that these gears turned slowly. But she trusted the steady power of procedure, knowing that real change always starts with someone refusing to turn away. Rachel, running on a mix of adrenaline and that steady resolve forged in years of public service, moved with purpose as she started to lay out her counterattack. She wasn't new to uphill battles or red tape that could stretch for months. With a steaming mug of chamomile tea in hand, she sat at her small kitchen table, flipping through her battered address book, searching for names she could trust inside Chicago's maze-like administration. Every note and email she wrote was crafted with careful attention. These weren't desperate cries for help. They were measured, well-documented steps, each one built on the belief that stubbornness, paired with the right connections, could nudge the system in her favor. Rachel drafted formal letters to the Chicago office of the Inspector General and slipped them into envelopes, pressing each flap down with a quiet kind of ritual. She made a call to Jamie, a community leader who had once organized neighborhood patrol watches, and texted Priya, a local attorney who spent time between court and volunteer clinics. Her messages were calm and precise, sticking to facts, not emotion. She made lists, double-checked phone numbers, and stayed up late researching policy codes. There was no part of this that was easy or quick, but Rachel knew the first steps in a good plan were always slow and steady. As Rachel quietly armed herself for the coming struggle. The world inside Officer Logan's precinct began to shift. The next time he showed up for his shift, he noticed a subtle change in the air. The usual nods and easy banter he'd come to expect were gone, replaced by clipped greetings and silent stares. In the break room, where there used to be laughs and easy conversation, Logan found himself eating lunch alone. He glanced around, pretending not to notice, but the quiet was deafening. It started with a few lowered voices at first. Then came more direct acts of distance. Conversations cut short when he entered, officers suddenly remembering someplace else they had to be. Even shifts traded behind his back. Old friends grew stiff, and those who had applauded his actions seemed unsure. Logan shrugged it off at first, convincing himself it was nothing, a bad week, maybe just jealousy. But as the isolation grew, so did his unease. The invisible barrier between him and the rest of the department became harder to ignore. Rachel's determination was already sending ripples through places she couldn't see. Word began to spread through the department just as Officer Logan received the official summons. It was a plain document, but its weight was unmistakable as it landed on his desk. The letterhead from the city's civilian office of police accountability seemed to glint under the fluorescent lights. Logan picked it up, his fingers brushing over the embossed seal, and he felt an unfamiliar chill. For the first time, the old comforts of his badge and the sturdy brick walls of the precinct didn't feel quite as secure. The words were straightforward. He was to report for a formal inquiry into his conduct on the night in question. No room for jokes. No place to hide behind old codes of silence. Suddenly, what had been business as usual no longer felt routine. Logan's hands sweated as he slipped the letter into his locker, hoping no one had seen. But rumors traveled fast, and by lunchtime the story had grown legs. There were whispered conversations in the hallways, and every time Logan entered a room, heads turned away or talking stopped altogether. It was as if the document in his hand branded him in a new way, stripping away layers of invisible protection he had counted on for years. Across town, Rachel was sitting by her window, letting the chaos of the city fill the silence in her apartment. She received confirmation from both the Inspector General's office and her attorney friend Priya. Her report was in motion, and the investigation was officially underway. Rachel's chest tightened, not from fear, but from a sudden realization of what her actions had set in motion. She had known this moment would come, but the reality was different than she'd imagined. The story was no longer just hers or Logan's. It belonged to every eye watching them, every person reading a headline or scrolling past a video online. Rachel leaned back and closed her eyes. She could almost feel the collective breath of a city holding itself in suspense. She was fully aware now that her choices had propelled events far beyond her own little corner of Chicago. The boundaries had shifted, and now the entire department, and maybe much more, was watching, waiting to see what would follow. The sense of fighting alone melted away, replaced by a quieter, deeper responsibility to the many who might one day have to make a similar stand. Winter crept in across Chicago, the kind that turned every morning sidewalk into a sheet of ice and chased folks into coffee shops for warmth. As snow started to build up along the curbs, new bits of information began seeping out from within the system itself. Someone somewhere, maybe motivated by conscience or the shifting winds, flagged Officer Logan's old body camera files. It turned out the device, which everyone thought barely worked, had quietly collected hours and hours of footage, clips showing traffic stops, street checks, moments of uncertainty and pressure. Some of those recordings were just routine, but others made even hardened investigators shift in their seats. There were cases where Logan's approach had been questionable, his tone sharp or his explanations thin. Every second captured by that little camera seemed to chip away at what had once felt like an iron wall of protection around the sergeant. The city's higher-ups, folks who had depended on silent loyalty, now found themselves cornered by evidence that refused to stay buried. Suddenly, the old code of silence in the department became almost deafening, a reminder of who had stayed quiet and for how long. Rachel heard about these new discoveries from Priya, who called one frosty evening and couldn't hide the relief in her voice. The investigation was no longer just about one bad call or an unfair ticket. It had cracked something much bigger. Rachel felt a strange combination of satisfaction and sadness as the truth came out into the open, knowing there were many like her who had crossed paths with people like Logan but never got even this much of a chance to speak. Word of the investigation spread far beyond official reports. Journalists started making phone calls, and community groups organized small meetings at the public library, trading stories and support. Slowly at first, more people began to come forward, some anonymous, some brave enough to put their names out there. Every statement, each quiet description of an encounter on a cold night, started to form a picture that was impossible to ignore. Rachel's actions were creating space for others, and as each voice joined the growing chorus, it became clear that this was the moment when something old and harmful might finally be forced to change. The city of Chicago was watching, and for once, people felt maybe, just maybe, their stories mattered. Inside the walls of the Chicago Police Department, the usual sense of unity was starting to break down. People who for years had stayed side by side now looked at each other with cautious eyes, not quite sure where loyalty stopped and self-preservation started. The police union, which had always stepped up to defend their officers, no matter what the headlines said, found itself caught in a bind. They held a meeting to decide what to do about Sergeant Logan. This time, when the vote came up, the union's support was less than enthusiastic. There were no strong speeches about standing by their own or fiery promises to shield Logan through thick and thin. Instead, there was a heavy silence, the weight of all the reports and stories hanging in the air. For officers who had always counted on the union as a last line of support, this shift felt like a warning. You could almost feel the current of anxiety running through the precinct hallways. Some wondered out loud if things were really going to change, or if this would blow over like all the times before. Veteran cops and fresh recruits alike kept their heads down and waited, uncertain how far these new winds would blow. The tension, thick as February fog, clung to every conversation. Even old friends found themselves tiptoeing, unsure what or whom to trust. On the other side of the city, Rachel was facing her own set of cracks and doubts. While her decision to speak up had inspired others, it also left her on new and shaky ground, with people she had once counted as dear friends. Some acted supportive in public, but pulled away in private, worried about getting caught in the storm that now swirled around her. Invitations for after-work drinks became rare, and text messages slowed to a trickle. Rachel felt that gap growing, especially late at night when the city was quiet and her thoughts chased each other in circles. She questioned herself, wondered if she had pushed too hard or made a mistake that would shut her out of communities she loved. Fighting for what is right, she was learning, came with a cost, a slow leak of trust and certainty, traded for the heavy responsibility of seeing things through. Still, even in the loneliness, Rachel clung to the hope that if she stayed her course, it might be worth it in the end. As the date for the hearing crept closer, everyone involved felt a kind of collective tension rise around them, almost like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see how things would end. The newspapers kept running updates, neighborhood groups sent out email blasts, and even casual conversations at the corner deli seemed to circle back to Sergeant Logan's pending judgment. It was a heavy feeling that seeped into both big moments and small ones. Rachel threw herself into the work, determined not to leave a single detail to chance. Each night, after her regular shift at the library, she spread her folders and notes across the scarred kitchen table, reviewing witness statements, comparing them with the body camera footage, and double-checking every copy of every letter she had sent. Her close friend Mia, who had a knack for finding legal loopholes and a gift for quiet encouragement, stopped by most evenings. Sometimes Mia brought fresh bagels, sometimes just herself and her methodical thinking. Together, they combed through the evidence, building not just a case but a story that could stand up to the questions and skepticism that were sure to come. Rachel was steady, but the idea that everything hung on her words weighed on her. Still, the small circle of people who believed in what she was doing helped her keep going. Mia was there with her practical support, while Priya kept in touch by phone, reminding Rachel that the courage to push back could ripple outward, changing things for more than just herself. Sergeant Logan, on the other hand, was living through his own slow unraveling. Back at the station, the sense of isolation was thick. He would linger in the hallway with his morning coffee, waiting for someone to fall into step beside him like before. But now even the friendliest officers were polite but distant. He reached out to past friends, tried arranging drinks, but his calls went to voicemail or were returned with rushed excuses about being busy. Days stretched longer. Logan, who once counted on camaraderie, found himself staring at closed doors and the silence that came with them. He spent more time thinking about the choices that led him there. The confidence that used to drive him had started to give way, replaced bit by bit with a mix of anxiety and regret. On both sides of the city, people waited, some anxious, some hopeful, and some just wanting it all to be over. The morning of the hearing came in with a steady Chicago drizzle and sharp gusts. Rolling off Lake Michigan, people moved quickly along Adams Street, heads ducked against the cold as they made their way to the federal courthouse. The building itself, all stone columns and heavy doors, had seen its share of dramatic days before, but there was something different in the air. Inside, the quiet shuffle of feet and the nervous scribble of pen on paper filled the room before anything had even begun. Rachel stood outside for a moment, rainwater darkening the hem of her practical navy suit. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, pushing open the courthouse doors with both hands. She did not come alone. Behind her, Mia and Priya followed, along with a few other supporters, some familiar faces from the neighborhood, others courtroom veterans there to watch history happening close up. Rachel's walk down the aisle was steady and deliberate, and though her heart thudded in her chest, she kept her chin up. The benches on either side filled with police officers, local reporters, and ordinary Chicagoans, all watching with a mix of curiosity, caution, and hope. Every eye in the room seemed to track Rachel as she crossed the wooden floor to the witness area. It was not just the uniform or her quick step that commanded attention. It was something quieter but stronger, a kind of authority that came from all the nights spent agonizing over the right thing to do, the friends she had lost, and the promises she had made to herself in the darkest hours. Her presence asked a question about what kind of justice belonged to Chicago and what sort of city it wanted to become. Even as lawyers shuffled files and the judge entered with an easy nod to the bailiff, the ordinary sounds of the courtroom seemed charged with meaning. No one was just an onlooker here. Everyone felt woven into the story, somehow invested in what the outcome might mean for them. Rachel didn't let her hands shake as she laid her folder down. She met every gaze that came her way, knowing this was about more than an argument between two sides. The real question hovered in the woodwork and echoed off the marble walls. Could truth, pressed forward by simple courage and careful preparation, hold its ground when it mattered most? An uneasy hush settled over the courtroom as the first of the body camera videos flickered onto the screen. Even the judge, who had likely seen it all before, leaned forward. The only sounds were the soft hum of the projector and the tap of rain on the courthouse windows. The footage played out simple, everyday patrol encounters, traffic stops, sidewalk conversations, fleeting questions on wintry nights. But the ordinary became riveting under this new light. Viewers could see clearly the tone in Sergeant Logan's voice when he pressed too hard for answers, or the way he handled situations with a confidence that sometimes tipped over into intimidation. Each scene turned into something heavier, almost like a new layer of evidence against years of routine. For Logan, every line of dialogue hit harder than he expected. Once, these interactions had felt like standard procedure. But now, watching them through the eyes of others, he saw twitchy body language, hesitant replies, and moments where folks just wanted to get away. Each word, each movement sent a ripple through the courtroom, making it impossible to dismiss what was shown. People in the room shifted in their seats, some with arms crossed tightly over their chests. A few police officers furrowed their brows, while others let out long breaths through their noses, the video stirring old memories of near misses and close calls. Rachel kept her gaze steady, not flinching once. She knew the power of these recordings. She had replayed them night after night, not out of spite, but to make sure she understood what really happened. This was not about one argument gone wrong. It was about a pattern, one that many had learned to accept or ignore. As the last clip faded to a close, you could almost feel a shift. The judge's face now held a seriousness that had not been there before. A small cough or the scrape of a chair seemed 10 times louder. The uncomfortable truth was right there, projected for everyone. This was not just about blaming one man. The videos made clear what Rachel and her supporters had been trying to say. When unchecked power is woven into habits and attitudes, it becomes nearly invisible until someone makes it plain. Now all those old certainties were under question, and nobody could say they had not seen. The tension inside the courthouse only grew as the next witness, Dr. Stephen Abbott, a well-known expert in police procedure from Northwestern School of Law, took the stand. He had flown in for the hearing, and people recognized his face from TV interviews about police reform across the country. There was a stir in the room. Folks leaned forward, hanging on every word, waiting to see what direction things would take now that someone with real authority was about to speak. Dr. Abbott started by quietly laying out the standards for lawful stops and the careful lines officers were supposed to walk in high-stress situations. He didn't just speak in dry legal terms. Instead, he broke things down so everyone could follow, pointing out where process and decency needed to overlap. As he reviewed the body camera footage, section by section, he paused at key moments and explained why certain phrases or tactics went against official training or federal guidelines. Each observation hit Sergeant Logan hard, especially when Dr. Abbott called out specific signs of bias, certain questions asked only to specific groups, moments where Logan seemed to press people differently based on how they looked. It felt as if the courtroom held its breath. There was more than just uncomfortable shifting now. People's eyes widened and hands clenched, and the judge's jaw tightened as some of the experts' remarks drove home the reality that the problem went further than one argument or bad day. It was out there now, exposed for everyone to see. Logan's defense attorney jumped in on cross-examination, trying to chip away at Dr. Abbott's credibility. He pointed out Rachel's determined posture and the way she handed over her Chicago Public Library ID, asking if maybe she acted too confident or tried to put herself above regular procedure. But the angle did not land the way he hoped. Each attempt to paint Rachel as arrogant only made her calm resolve stand out even more, revealing how a quest for justice could often be mistaken for pride by people on the other side. By the end of the specialist's testimony, the stakes had shifted. There was no putting the lid back on what had been spilled out. Dr. Abbott had not just criticized Logan, he had pointed a light at a bigger issue, and nobody in that old courtroom could claim ignorance anymore. Manipulation fell flat, and what truly mattered separated itself from the noise. It was right after Dr. Abbott's strong testimony that something entirely unplanned shook the room even further. The court called Captain Douglas Ross, Logan's direct supervisor, to the stand. Most people in the courthouse had not expected Captain Ross to play such a key role, but by now everyone understood that surprises were part of the process. The judge's expression was hard to read as Captain Ross entered, straightening his uniform jacket with slow hands. His reputation for fairness stretched across the city, but lately he had worn the strain of this case on his features. When the questioning began, he seemed careful at first, measuring every answer. But when pressed about any prior knowledge of Logan's behavior, Captain Ross paused, took a shaky breath, and nodded slightly. He revealed that months before this hearing, he had shared concerns about Logan's actions with a few colleagues. It was just an informal conversation in the break room, nothing logged officially, but he admitted that certain things worried him enough to bring them up quietly. The words fell heavy in the courtroom. This was not just about one person making a bad call. There was now proof that leadership had noticed warning signs and, for whatever reason, chose not to make a record or follow up with real consequences. People blinked in shock, understanding at once how thin the lines between silence and complicity could be. The judge leaned forward, pen halfway to paper, as though trying to decide what this new information would mean. Even the defense seemed rattled, realizing that their narrative of Logan as a misunderstood outlier was starting to look thin. All the while, word began to filter out of the courthouse. Reporters sent updates from courthouse steps. Photos and snippets of Captain Ross's testimony made their way into news alerts and social media posts. Folks in coffee shops and train cars argued over who was really to blame and what should happen next. For the first time, public opinion started to shift in real time. People who once dismissed the case as just another department squabble now saw it as something bigger, about transparency, about admitting mistakes, about whether anyone in power would actually answer for ignoring the obvious. For Logan, it was overwhelming. The sense of control he had always counted on was slipping fast now, replaced with questions about every decision he had made. The truth, finally out, left nothing standing in its old place. As the trial entered its final stretch, the unexpected kept coming. Early on, a grey Monday morning, the Chicago Police Union released a sharp public statement to the press. It was clear and direct. They wanted no connection to Sergeant Logan's choices, and the union leadership said that what had happened in this case showed a need for sweeping changes. Overnight, the support system Logan relied on thinned out, until it was just him, standing apart from the blue wall that for years had felt unbreakable. The fallout from the union's announcement spread fast. Reporters ran with the headline, "Talk shows put out call-in segments, and suddenly neighborhood meetings overflowed with people who once would not have cared." The sense of isolation that had been creeping up on Logan now settled in fully. For a long time he had believed others would stand by him through anything, that loyalty mattered more than what outsiders thought. But now, as old friends stopped replying to his messages and former allies stayed quiet, the reality sank in that he was carrying the weight of his decisions alone. Rachel watched the news unfold with the same mixed feelings that had haunted her since the hearing started. It would have been easier, maybe, if victory felt lighter, but there was no feeling of triumph, just an uneasy relief. She had always understood that real change was wider and harder than a single verdict. One problem solved in a courtroom did not fix the pressures, unspoken rules, or routines that kept problems alive in the first place. Instead, each bit of progress came with a price: lost friendships, hurt trust, and moments where Rachel wondered if the fight might cost more than anyone expected. Waking up to headlines or seeing her own name come up on social media gave her no comfort. The people who criticized her determination just made her more anxious, sowing tiny seeds of doubt about whether speaking up was really the right thing, or if she had only pulled herself away from the world she loved. But she also knew deep down that none of this was really about personal gain. The point was never her reputation, but the hope that standing up could help mend something important, even if change came slow. Both Rachel and Logan now saw the city around them differently. There were no easy heroes or easy villains, just complicated lives and a story that was not close to finished. It was not long before the events at the Chicago Federal Courthouse exploded into national headlines. The local news had covered every detail, but now stations from New York to Los Angeles sent camera crews and reporters to stake out the steps on Adams Street. Rachel's face, with its steady, unflinching gaze, appeared on the covers of news magazines and in long stories about the struggle for fairness in big city police departments. People she did not know sent notes about how her story made them see their own neighborhoods in a new way. Politicians weighed in from across the country, saying that the trial marked a turning point and promising reforms that, in better moments, felt almost possible. But as quickly as attention came, so did new challenges. It was not the kind of fame anyone would ask for. Rachel started noticing the changes almost right away. There would be whispers when she pushed her cart through the grocery store on a Saturday morning, or awkward pauses when she entered a local coffee shop she once visited every week. Some people stared a little too long, while others suddenly looked away, busying themselves with their phones or fiddling with their keys. At home, Rachel fielded phone calls from numbers she did not recognize. Some just hung up without saying a word, but a few calls carried careful warnings, telling her to be careful where she went and who she talked to. At first, she tried to brush it off as nerves, but the unease stuck around. One time, as she unlocked her car outside the library, she saw a group of teenagers whispering and watching, and for the first time since all this began, she wondered seriously about her own safety. Even old friends felt further away. Jenny, who used to call every Sunday, now sent only the occasional text. David, who had always lent a friendly ear, stopped meeting up for weekend walks along Lake Michigan after saying he needed some space. It hurt more than Rachel wanted to admit. She had never cared about being noticed by strangers, and now all this attention felt more like a burden than any kind of reward. Yet, in the middle of the spotlight and suspicion, Rachel kept her routines as best she could. She knew that every step she took would be seen by people she would never meet, and that each choice mattered twice as much as it used to. It was a lonely feeling, but she had made her decision and would walk her path, hoping change would finally find a foothold in her city. Everything changed again. The afternoon the Department of Justice declared they would open a full-scale investigation into every year of Sergeant Logan's career. It was more than just an inquiry into one argument or a single complaint. Now the spotlight was on Logan's entire record. Old reports and dusty files were about to be pulled out and examined not just by local officials, but by federal investigators. TV trucks gathered outside police headquarters as reporters speculated about what might come to light. Logan, once sure of his standing, was suddenly the focus of questions, not just about one mistake, but about a lifetime of choices. This announcement carried a different kind of weight. It meant the system itself could no longer look away. Logan's colleagues and supervisors were called into uncomfortable meetings. Veteran officers who used to share quiet jokes in the break room became cautious, wary of being connected to any part of the story. New recruits looked wide-eyed at their mentors, wondering how deep the problems might go. Some people said they hoped the investigation would clear up years of rumors, while others were almost afraid of what would surface. In houses along the south side and in busy office towers downtown, conversations about justice and accountability picked up speed, traveling from kitchen tables to city council meetings. Standing in her small apartment that evening, Rachel took it all in from the glow of the television. The news anchors debated whether this could finally make law enforcement more open and honest, or if it would just create another round of tense headlines. For Rachel, the shift brought mixed feelings. She had started out fighting for her own respect, her own dignity, but now she felt the struggle widening around her. It was clear this was no longer just her personal battle, or even Logan's alone. There was a strange kind of pride in knowing her voice had contributed to such a larger push for change, but also a sharper awareness that the personal cost would only grow. The sense of responsibility swelled. She knew other people, many she would never meet, were watching and drawing courage from what she did. At the same time, Rachel realized that the last bits of her old, quiet life were gone. She could not melt back into the crowd, and neither could the questions she'd raised. The city seemed to turn with her, waiting to see what would happen next. A couple of days after the Justice Department's announcement made the nightly news, Rachel's phone rang late in the afternoon, just as she was about to pour herself a cup of tea. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her pick up. The voice on the line introduced himself as Michael Booker, a coordinator from the Chicago Civilian Police Oversight Committee, the new independent body tasked with reviewing practices across city law enforcement. He explained in a tone that was both formal and quietly urgent that their members had discussed her case and believed her perspective could help their work. They wanted Rachel to consider joining the committee. It was not offered as a reward or an olive branch. It was more of an acknowledgement that her story had changed things, and that change needed careful guidance from someone who had lived through it. Rachel thanked Michael, though her mind was already racing. By the time she hung up, her hand was shaking just a little. She sat in silence for a moment, listening to the city's evening traffic roll by outside her window, letting the weight of the invitation settle in. It felt huge, more demanding than anything that had come before. If she stepped onto that committee, she would stand in the open, not just as a symbol in someone else's story, but as an active part of shaping what would come next. People would have opinions, and not all of them would be kind. Thinking about it, Rachel knew the risks. There would be critics who said she only wanted attention, and others who questioned every suggestion she made. It meant more meetings and more time spent combing through old reports, reliving the difficult parts. It would pull her even further from any hope of returning to her old, quieter life. The city would see even more of her, and there was no way to guarantee the support would outweigh the resentment. But the idea of turning the offer down left Rachel uneasy. She pictured the families waiting for answers, young people looking for fairness from the very people meant to protect them, and those quiet conversations she'd overheard at library tables and on bus rides, when people wondered aloud if anything would ever change. Refusing would feel like walking away from them after opening the door. So she sat at her kitchen table for a long time, thinking about her place in a city that was still finding its way forward, knowing that her choice would shape more than just her own future. The lawsuit's ripples finally reached City Hall. Not 2 weeks after Rachel's invitation to join the Civilian Review Committee, the mayor's office called its own press conference at Daley Plaza. Under a bright blue spring sky, with tulips blooming in garden beds along the sidewalks, the mayor herself stepped to the mic and announced that all members of the Chicago Police Department, regardless of rank or division, would now be required to attend comprehensive trainings on respect and recognizing unconscious bias. The message was simple. Chicago was not just talking about change anymore. It was putting new standards into action. Word spread quickly throughout the city, showing up in snippets on news radio during morning commutes and in printed bulletins on community center walls. Some people greeted the new rules with cautious hope, believing they marked the start of a real shift in the way officers treated residents. Others, a little more jaded, wondered if mandatory classes could reshape something as deeply rooted as habit and culture. Rachel listened from her living room as city officials detailed plans to work with outside experts and to measure every step, knowing that even imperfect beginnings could grow into something better with honesty and effort. Each day, the city seemed just a little different. You could feel it in the way people spoke to one another at the corner store, or in the way folks on buses glanced up from their phones a little longer, ready to notice things that used to go unseen. For Rachel, though, progress was far from simple or sweet. Her nights often passed restlessly, sleep broken by uneasy memories or thoughts of the people whose stories had never made headlines. Some evenings, she found herself replaying old arguments or worrying about whether anything she had done would last past the first round of training sessions. Yet amid her fears, there was an undercurrent of relief. The city's efforts, however messy, meant her story had not faded into background noise. She had pushed a stubborn system just far enough that it had started to bend. Hope flickered at the edges of her exhaustion, quiet and unsteady, but real. Even when Rachel longed for the simpler anonymity she once knew, she kept going, moved by a sense that moral fights almost always come with a price. In the wider world, spring had arrived and change, slow but unstoppable, was in bloom all around her. As the reforms began to roll out across the city, new faces stepped into the conversation, making Rachel realize she was no longer carrying the burden on her own. Among them was Lucas Thompson, a determined judge who had gained a reputation for holding everyone in his courtroom to the same standard. Lucas's commitment to fairness was strong, but practical. He believed that real change came not just from ideas, but from steady, hands-on actions. Whenever things got especially tense, like when public opinion flared or another story broke in the news, Lucas was the one who found the right words to remind everyone why the work mattered. He was not all about speeches or press releases, but his steady presence made even the most difficult days feel possible. Then there was Mark Sanders, whose job would never land him in front of a camera, but who worked every bit as hard. Mark had spent years as a community liaison, moving quietly between police precincts and neighborhood groups. He knew when to listen, when to step in, and how to bring people to the table even if they did not always agree. Whether he was sharing coffee with officers at a Southside diner or organizing late-night town hall meetings for families who felt forgotten, Mark brought a rare kind of energy. He bridged gaps no one else seemed able to cross, showing through patient everyday kindness that trust was built over time. What truly surprised Rachel was the shift in Leslie Parker, the local union president who had started out as one of her fiercest critics. For weeks, Leslie's skepticism had been impossible to miss. She challenged every suggestion and warned that outside interference would only stir up trouble. But as new policies began to take hold and more officers shared stories of positive changes in their work, Leslie's tone changed. One Friday afternoon, at a well-attended press conference, she stepped up and publicly endorsed Rachel's proposals for transparency and ongoing training. It caught almost everyone off guard and made clear that the city's push for reform had gained a measure of legitimacy it desperately needed. In that moment, Rachel finally saw what could happen when unlikely alliances formed. It was never about being the loudest voice or having every answer. Progress, she realized, came from the willingness to listen and to accept help, even from those who did not always see things the same way. Sometimes change worked its way in through side doors, quiet, determined, and ready to move the world. Public victories often looked shiny from the outside, but when Rachel closed her apartment door in the evenings, she was faced with the quieter, heavier cost of her choices. It became obvious in small ways at first. She stopped getting text messages from college friends asking her to join Sunday brunches or movie nights. Invitations to birthday parties or baby showers stopped coming, replaced by awkward apologies about schedules or not wanting any awkwardness. Even routine gestures, a neighbor waving in the hallway or a co-worker sliding into the seat beside her at the coffee shop, grew less warm, sometimes disappearing entirely. People she had grown up with in the city stopped calling or danced around her name when old memories came up. Rachel recognized this pattern as the other side of fighting. For something bigger than herself, standing up for what is right, she learned, did not just rattle institutions, it also unsettled long-time friendships and daily comforts. Some of her neighbors treated her with caution, avoiding eye contact or keeping their greetings tight and quick. It was not outright hostility, but something cooler, more like uncertainty that made everyday life lonelier by degrees. There were nights when this loneliness pressed in harder. Rachel found herself sitting by the kitchen window, watching snow start to build up on the fire escape, wondering if people misunderstood her or if it was simply easier for them to keep their distance. Sometimes she scrolled through old photos, on her phone, faces blurred now by time and separation, remembering how things once felt, safe and ordinary. Yet, even on the nights when the city felt especially cold and quiet, she refused to let her resolve slip. Each loss's sting reminded her that every fight worth having comes with a cost, and sometimes that price is carried in silence. Rachel told herself that those closed doors and sidelong glances were, in their own stubborn way, signs that people respected her strength, even if they could not bring themselves to say so out loud. Maybe they did not agree. Maybe they were afraid of the change, but they could not quite ignore what she stood for. She would hold on to her courage, understanding. It was always the most expensive virtue there is, and even in her solitude, Rachel never doubted that doing the hard thing, standing up, speaking out, was worth the price she paid. Weeks rolled by, and before Rachel knew it, she found herself stepping onto the stage at the Harold Washington Auditorium, standing beneath the high lights before an audience of fresh, nervous faces. It was the annual welcoming event for the newest recruits to the Chicago Police Department, a tradition meant to set the tone for those just starting out. The room was packed, the buzz of quiet chatter echoing up to the domed ceiling as young men and women in crisp uniforms fidgeted with their ties and scarves, all eyes darting with a mix of excitement and worry. Rachel stood at the podium, feeling the weight of all she had been through, each moment etched into the lines of her face and the way she held herself. She took a slow breath and began to speak. Her voice was steady, her words plain. She did not try to impress or inspire with big promises. Instead, she spoke to the new recruits about the everyday meaning of fairness. Justice, she told them, is not a banner to wave just when someone's watching. It's something we do quietly, every single day, in how we treat people on the street, in how we talk to those who disagree, and even in how we admit when we are wrong. As she talked, Rachel noticed the room grow still. The recruits leaned forward, some nodding quietly, others just listening, maybe wondering who they would become in this new job. She shared stories from her own journey, careful to focus less on the moments of drama and more on the choices made in the grey areas, the hard decisions when no one would have blamed her for staying silent, and the times when integrity meant feeling very alone. Outside those doors, spring had finally broken through the grey months. Tulips spread in bright patches across downtown. The wind off the lake carried that clean, new smell. It felt as if the whole city was waking up, stretching out its limbs after a heavy sleep. Standing there, Rachel realized this transformation was bigger than any one story or headline. That day, she understood the true reach of her struggle. The institution she had challenged and cared enough to help reshape was not the only thing changed. Each person in that audience carried something new inside them, a bit of her fight and her hope. Whatever paths they would take, justice and honor in Chicago would never quite look the same again.